Welcome to BAM It with John, Michael, and Mari, covering all things business, accounting, marketing, management, and IT. The place where businesses and entrepreneurs find the forest through the trees.
Welcome to BAM It with John Michael Cletus of Peridot Consulting and Mari Peterson of Marketing Outpost. And we're going to continue part 2 now of the gig economy with our interview here with Dave. And here we are with my good friend Dave Bronner, and I'm excited that he's actually taken the time to sit down and talk with us today. And I'm extra excited because I don't know why he would admit this, but he's actually a fan of our podcast. So we do know, beyond my mother-in-law and myself, there's at least a third person listening to this podcast, and that would be Dave. So Dave, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, John Michael. Thank you, Maury. It's good to be here. And there actually is another fan. It's my dog.
Oh.
Every time I listen to the podcast, I make sure that Cole, my dog, the Black Labrador Retriever, is in close by.
Yeah.
Should we do a shout out? Hey, Cole.
Hey, Cole.
Hey, Cole. Here, boy. Here, Cole. We'll see if he perks to that. Anyway, so we're going to just ask you some questions about the gig economy and about what you do and everything. I know this is, we've already done the intro. So
tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'll be happy to. My name is David Bronner. Dave is my nickname for the most part. I'm originally from New Orleans, Louisiana, or the New Orleans, Louisiana area. Educated predominantly in Louisiana, both undergraduate and professionally. Mm-hmm. After graduation from all of the academics, I joined a material handling equipment firm, which is basically warehouse equipment. And the big challenge then was doing high-rise lifting of product and service. Being a fairly innovative thinker, coupled with a firm who was then a prime contractor to the NASA, Department of Defense, and developed a product and actually patented a product and a process. So that was an interesting development in my early 30s. Wow. Yes, that was around 30 to 31 years old. And that has done and still continues to do very well. That aerospace contractor, because of protection and certain defense covenants, purchased the engineering company for whom I was working. That was an interesting series of a couple of years. And then I joined a burgeoning organization called the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. At that point in time, it was still under the Department of Defense. Went from FEMA through the ranks, and I still, to some degree, have an association with FEMA. And the gig economy is the antithesis of what I started. I started in a very rudimentary, not 9 to 5 necessarily, but I was quite mobile, but in the corporate world with the tie and the right suit and the right shoes. And
or the paradigm of the day.
It was. It certainly was. My contemporaries were also those that were doing well, were doing exceptionally well. And this was the pre-Reagan economy. And when the buyout occurred, it occurred during the early years of the Reagan economy, which was boom. It just boomed like crazy. It came to an abrupt stop during the Challenger disaster in 1986, but it continued. So with FEMA, came Homeland Security. After 9/11 of 2001, Homeland Security occurred as a result of the Homeland Security Act of 2002 by President George Bush. And so the work in Homeland and in FEMA was public policy. Public policy was a lot of writing, a lot of interpretation of law, putting law into what's called the Code of Federal Regulations, which is an interpretation element of what a CFR, as it's known, Code of Federal Regulations, interprets and applies the law. So the book on the tax code is applied by a certain code of federal regulation.
So you started out working from FEMA to the Homeland Security.
Correct.
And somewhere in there, you're an attorney, right?
Yeah. What transcended all of that is, as situations develop with any disaster or pre-disaster, there's always challenges from municipalities, state agencies, local governments, private nonprofits, and what have you, regarding decisions that were made in the field regarding eligibility of a home or whether or not that particular commercial building was eligible. And it gave almost every property and nearly every disaster its uniqueness. And that is what lit me up. Everything was unique. There wasn't one answer. It had to be contemplated a great deal. Promulgated is the formal term. So that led into what we now know as alternative dispute resolution, or ADR, mediation, arbitration, and a few other types in English law.
When did you become an attorney?
Almost 10 years later.
I see. Okay, so then you were doing mediations also?
It was the dawn of everything. As I mentioned earlier, when you're on the forefront, as my colleagues and I were, we had certain rules and regulations, but we kind of made them and passed them through Congress. A lot of legislation, a lot of judicial overwatch occurred, but it was an incredible field to watch developing right in front of you that helped so many people in so many disasters over so many years.
It's really interesting. When you were doing the material equipment handling, what was your role there? Was that like on the engineering side?
No, it was the executive side.
Oh, I see. Okay.
It was the executive side. It was the client development. It was the insurance that products worked before they left. It was the oversight of basically everything: marketing, management, accounting, HR, you name it.
So bring us forward now, and this topic of the gig economy. What do you do now?
What I do is I have several things they're somewhat independent, but for example, they're out of Homeland and particularly out of FEMA disaster. I became what's called a floodplain manager, which is a fancy term for being able to interpret hydraulic maps to determine if and when floodplains shift. And hydraulic waters always shift over time. And in certain communities, it's so profound that letters of map revision and so forth have to be made before the next disaster. So we're kind of on the front end of that. And concurrent with that, I have a certification as an emergency manager as well. And that's an industry peer recognition that I've taken certain classes and passed certain tests, and I'm able to certify plans that are in accordance with the policies, practices, and procedures of FEMA, or not.
So if you mind me asking you this, about how you can give us like a 10-year range of what is your age range?
I am 65 years old as of 2 weeks ago.
Okay, and
Well,
good for
happy
you.
birthday.
Thank
Happy
you.
birthday. Me too. When's your birthday?
August 29th.
August 20th. How about that?
How about that?
Moving on from that. So going from what you were just describing as a very paradigmic 9-to-5 sort of mundane, even more so because you're working in governmental agencies,
Right.
to the present, you were just mentioning some. You have a list there of just all the things you do. Can you just read that list and we can delve into a little bit, because I'm going to have a follow-up question. I just want to hear let the people hear just this list.
Sure. A certified construction inspector, a notary public, obviously. I do training in a classroom for police and law enforcement on courtroom testimony procedures and report writing and so forth. I also serve with the Service Corps of Retired Executive, or SCORE, locally and also regionally. And I do some consulting work with a couple of high-end builders in terms of their operations. Certain areas of one particular one needs some help with change orders and so forth. I basically put life into the document so where it's concurrent with the contract, and do the collection work when it's necessary and so forth. So that covers, there's a couple of other things that I do for fun.
Yeah.
One of which is volunteer with my church, and the other one is related to doing some medical courier work.
Medical what?
Courier.
Oh.
So
Are you like transporting blood and hazardous materials?
Nuclear.
Oh.
All nuclear. And that kind of relates back to Homeland and the ability to understand and transport or not certain levels of radioactive materials over the highways. That's regulated by.
You don't have any of that on the desk right now, do
No,
you?
I don't.
Okay,
I
good.
cleaned up very well before I came here,
Okay,
knowing
good.
I was going to see Mark.
I just watched that whole series. Did you watch that about Chernobyl?
Yes,
Did you see that?
I
Whoa.
did.
What did you
Excellent.
think of that?
It was
That
catastrophic.
scared the heck out of me. I didn't you don't realize the full scope of something like that until you like really watch that and say, how close are we to that again?
Fukushima also.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was the more recent.
Yes, it was.
So let's get into, we're talking about the gig economy today, about how you are now living within that as a person that's 65 years old, coming from that old paradigm. So let's just talk about, like, what do you think the stereotype is of the gig economy, and from what other people might think it is versus what it actually is, or your experience of that?
That's a good question. From a personal perspective, I moved completely away mentally from what I thought was going to be a series of 1 or 2 day jobs. I don't really get going until the 3rd or 4th week of a typical project. So it was a brain shift in my mind that filtered over to the client. I'd listen to the client, understand what they expected, formulated the responses, and most of them were needed in 2 to 4 days. I needed the paradigm shift more so than I ran into people that were resisting it. While I wasn't resisting it, I had a little hard time adjusting to the fact that the scope of work is this, and I could do that in 24 hours or 48 or as many as 72 hours and be happy with it. I got paid regularly and was re-engaged on a regular basis, which was my way of determining that the job was done adequately and they were satisfied with it.
I have so many random questions, so I guess we'll save those for after we go through this kind of set of questions. But one of the random questions that I want you to stick in the back of your head is, how do you determine how to tell somebody what part of what you do out of that long list?
That's a good question, and it takes me a little while to prepare for an interview.
Okay.
A lot of what I do is referral, but not all. And the not all piece is keeping the pipeline loaded with client prospects, for example. I'm never fully actualized in that area. So I practice interviews with people that are far younger than me and in the mirror, just because I've walked into a room with either my CV or the resume, depending on what the scope of the work required. And sometimes it's a panel that wants to see this person that they're potentially going to engage. And a lot of times I see, like positive eyebrows. And the other times I see just the opposite.
So depending on who you're going before, others either expect you to be a lot younger or they're very happy that you are a mature adult.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Perfectly put.
Okay.
And it's interesting now that it's happened enough times where I don't predict it, but I'm prepared for it. Because I try to not show, I try to show the face that needs to be seen, which is the real face. But I watch and listen. Neuro-linguistic programming is a very important topic for me. People will tell you subtly or very non-subtly what they're thinking. So the level of questions that come, if they come at all, from some people at that table. And it gives me pause to recognize what other groups of people of various ages and ethnic backgrounds see and feel when perhaps they see and feel the same thing.
So is that kind of going into what you would say is maybe a stereotype?
Yes, I do. Most of the folks that I know that are near my age or slightly older have stopped working and looked forward to it for a great period of their working career. On the other hand, while that day is out there for me, I don't see it anytime soon. So they are my friends, and I don't golf, for example. I don't dislike it, but you got to be.
You're not scheduling a cruise every other month?
No, nothing like that. So I tend to run with people that are ages that are half mine, perhaps, or slightly more than half mine in terms of clientele. Touch them at least once a day in some way. Check in. You need anything, or I've got the project moved along to a point where I need you to review the draft before I put it in good format, depending on what hat is on, or hats perhaps that are on that day. today I'm wearing 2 hats besides this interview with you.
Okay. So going back to, what would you say then about this kind of work that you're doing now is the best part about it?
The best part about it is the diversity, meaning that I prepare differently for a day of, depending on some of the above that I articulated for you. And it works different parts of my psyche, different parts of my personality. I do have that Myers-Briggs personality indicator, and I try to challenge it once in a while, and I'm able to overcome what, a couple of those letters mean.
It sounds like you're very adaptable, and I would think that would be a characteristic that if you're working in what we call a gig economy, you need to be highly adaptable.
Excellent point, Mari. It's something that either you do that or you don't succeed.
Right.
Unless you have 1 or 2 areas that is really your sweet spot.
So then conversely, what would you say is something you don't like about this style and type of work living that you're doing now?
The work-life balance is often a challenge. I've been an early riser and an early reporter to do whatever I'm doing since my earliest time at work. So typically a day for me starts somewhere between 2 and 4 a.m.
That's an early riser?
It's an early
That's
riser.
like when I'm going to bed.
Well, that's when I actually start. I rise
What time do you go to bed?
early, 6-ish,
Uh-huh.
5.
So you really are on a totally different kind of work schedule.
Hold it. And that's the beauty part about it. When I'm done,
You must get a lot done.
I do.
So between that 2 and 8 a.m., you're doing a lot of work?
That's my core. You
Oh.
just happen to pick between 2 and 7 is where I get most, 80%, the Pareto principle. I'm getting 80% of my work done. The early part of the day, getting things done quickly, is personified many different places, given the level of what I need to do. The types of products and services that are required are due early morning. And
So
I will
that
just
works for you.
put a stop there.
Yeah, to
Okay.
get it done by 7 a.m., you're already ahead of the schedule.
Yes.
And you're ready because those people are coming in at 7 and they're wanting to make all these decisions and
Correct.
move forward. I got it. Okay.
So, given this industry, given that you've been living in the gig economy now for a good number of years and practicing the gig economy, I guess, just the gig economy, what are some challenges you see within that paradigm of work?
There's probably a couple that transcend almost any industry. First of all, as I said earlier, assuring myself that I'm putting enough clients in the pipeline to produce the income that's necessary, given the level of service, but particularly stopping the diversity. I've gotten I'm very proud of the spectrum of what I can do. I don't want to do any more than that, so I'd rather do what I'm doing better.
Not spread yourself out too thin.
Correct. There will be a point of diminishing returns, and that's usually getting fired when you do that. I've had that happen, and it's not fun. And it's usually because I overcommitted my abilities or my staff's abilities to deliver.
Got it. We've
And-
all done that. We call it multitasking, but
Exactly.
it's not necessarily multi-achieving anything.
Well, with that, what are some of the opportunities?
The opportunities are endless. They're as endless as your personality or perhaps your professional background and your training will allow you. The internet is a great tool, obviously, to do research on what's coming. I try to stay abreast of trends in marketing, for example. I frequently discuss some financial aspects of it with John Michael on behalf of one particular client. So the challenges are endless opportunities, and where do you stop? And number 2 is ensuring that you've got the right engagement letter to make sure that that deliverables we all agree on, and you're getting paid. But I think the most important and the most enjoyable part is what I call the hunt. I like to hunt rather than gather, and I characterize hunting as new client formulation, gathering being executing on work I already have and dragging it into the cave and cooking it. It's always the most fun for me to go out and kill.
Like, I love to cook, but I don't like to clean up.
There you go.
There you go.
And where do you see the evolution of the gig economy in the next 5, 10, 15 years?
It's a very good question. I had an opportunity well before the opportunity to come speak with you to talk to a staffing company about a scope of work that I'm working towards. And it's a well-known organization, they characterized the gig economy as the new norm in terms of their clients that they seek and the applicants that they fish for. This group services more clients than they do applicants, but obviously they screen them. And they're doing more and more placements that are shorter and shorter engagements. Most are not statutory engagements or W-2 engagements. Most of them are 1099 engagements. Some are abroad. And obviously, there's opportunity in a lot of things that I've mentioned in both South America, in the Orient, in the emerging world.
Okay, and we're going to bring in technology. How has technology helped or hurt in what you do within this?
Technology for me was, I was a late bloomer to the laptop computer, but now it's my best tool. And so is a small dictaphone device. As a sole proprietor, moving around as much as I do, both driving and flying, ideas and whole engagements are often dictated to myself. I listen to it later on one of the GarageBand type programs, and then oftentimes the second cut at writing something is better than the first cut. And I always thought my first cuts were the best. Secondarily, obviously, the use of video, some of the products, and also some of the presentation mediums, PowerPoint pages, depending on your platform. I've gone back to school locally on a couple of occasions, to not necessarily for the certifications, but to stay abreast, for example, on the Macintosh platform as well as the developing PC platforms, because I cross-platform a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, now it's like 50-50, right? When
Just
you run
about.
across people.
Yep.
Okay.
And yeah, I heard you earlier just mention about within this gig economy. Do you feel like in your current position you're doing the gig economy out of necessity, or is it because it's just you're just harnessing all these talents?
More so the latter.
Yeah.
I always like to challenge myself to a point of diminishing returns, as I mentioned earlier. But when I first started it, my mindset then versus today are completely different. It was something I didn't dread, but I figured, okay, I got to be 3 things today. How am I going to do that well? And I practice in limited, wrote, journal a lot. That I can't tell you how much help that is. What I've done well, what I've done poorly, what I think I need training on, and that sort of thing. Self-evaluation.
So what I see in your case is that you're an experienced individual or wealth of experience. In your case, you're taking advantage of that experience, of those many talents, to utilize this gig economy. Whereas maybe somebody younger is using the gig economy out of necessity. So there is going to be a difference there. Some people take advantage, some out of necessity.
Fully agree.
I think a little bit of both. I think some people may not be necessity. They want the independence and the freedom. Did you officially at any point retire? Like, did you retire from your corporate traditional background and said, okay, I'm leaving X company after so many years? Or did it just sort of merge into this way of working?
It merged more so than I had a hard stop on anything.
Uh-huh.
Some of those stops happened, but it wasn't to retire.
Right.
It was to move on to something else. Yeah.
I see. How long have you been working in this style and method?
I have to pause for a second on that one. Approximately 8 years ago. I saw this coming, and it was a bit of a jump, not off of a cliff rather. It was more off of a hill. And when I landed safely and comfortably, I enjoyed it. I can do this. And that self-assessment, as I mentioned, self-actualization is important to me, that I can still do things, and it gets me going. It gets my blood pumping.
Well, I think that's what my question was I think some people maybe perhaps, and maybe you know this more than I do, but maybe they retire officially and then they're like, wait a minute, I don't really want to retire. They do the retirement thing for a few years and they're like, no, I really want to get back to utilizing my experiences and that I've had, to produce work. Do you see that?
I do. By and large, my network of people personally, my age and slightly older, slightly younger, that had that hard stop, probably 8 out of 10 did it for a short period of time. There's only so much fishing, there's only so much golf or traveling. And it wasn't predominantly dictated by economics, personal income, as much as it was utilization.
Of your brain.
One is running a nonprofit for $1 a year.
Yeah.
And loving it.
Yeah. Yeah. Because there's also not that pressure as in
Precisely.
Before when you had that. So do you often find yourself, I don't know if this would be another part of your gig economy job profile, but do you ever consult with other people like yourself that say, hey, I like what you're doing and I want to do that too, utilizing my own skills and experiences. Do you ever do that?
I've had some people refer friends of theirs that have been downsized unexpectedly and they've somewhat panicked a little bit. And I've talked to them to kind of talk them off the cliff and onto the hill, as I mentioned.
What is your advice to them?
Trust yourself. Trust what you've been given. Utilize every day. Read incessantly. Never stop learning. Never stop finding motivation to talk to the guy or the lady on the other side of the coffee shop, for example, or next to you on a plane. Just what do you do? I'd like to learn more about what you do. And then it's a natural. It's a Dale Carnegie principle that I learned many, many years ago that still works.
I like that. And I think that's a beautiful wrap up.
Oh, I thought you had more questions.
No.
I'm just back here letting Mari ask her questions.
John Michael has gone to sleep over here.
No,
I'm just kidding. He hasn't. He never would do that.
I totally was just like, you got a laundry list of questions here. I'm just going to sit back and watch.
No, but I think that's a beautiful wrap up because I think that this episode would leave people with that question. Well, maybe that's something I want to explore. And what do I do? And I think that's a great advice is to never stop listening to other people and asking questions and trust yourself.
Correct. Never stop trying things. Even though, Thomas Edison had 910 successful inventions and patents and
Didn't make him stop.
3 times that many failed, but he still did it.
Well, Dave, we really appreciate you taking the time to meet with us today. It's great talking to you. I've always enjoyed our conversations outside of this. Hopefully I can call you a friend at this point. But I want to thank you for your time today. And
I say thank you. And I think we could even come up with another thing for you to do because there are a lot of people here that I think would be interested in picking your brain about how to segue into the same style of work, especially here in Asheville where everybody likes to be independent.
Of course. And thank you both for the opportunity to be here. As an avid listener, it's a different perspective on this side of the microphone. Because when it comes on, I just turn the volume way up to hear all the voices and all the inflections and gauge what's important. But it's been a joy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we want to thank the listeners for joining us today, and please be sure to review this episode. And for more information on who we are or this podcast, please visit www.bammit.com. That's BAMM-IT.com. And our next podcast is going to be about the marketing and the marketing industry.
We'll have a branding person we're going to talk to, and then also a digital media person.
The hosts and the guests of this podcast make no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk. This podcast should not be considered professional advice and is for entertainment purposes. It is not guaranteed that you will find this as entertaining as the hosts find themselves.